The rain had just started to fall when the Anderson family arrived at their new home in Clintonville in Ohio. The old farmhouse stood on the edge of a sprawling, untamed field, its white paint peeling, and its windows reflecting the overcast sky. Katrina Anderson stared at it through the windshield, feeling a weight settle deep in her chest. It wasn't the house she had wanted. It wasn't the life she had envisioned for her family, but after Ethan's death, nothing had felt right anymore. "Mom, look!" Mickey's voice broke through Katrina's thoughts, her daughter's small finger pointing toward the second-story window. "There's a boy up there!" Katrina turned her gaze to the window Mickey pointed at, but saw nothing, just the darkened glass staring back. She forced a smile, her tone gentle. "It's probably just your imagination, sweetheart. The house has been empty for a long time." Mickey frowned but didn't say anything more. Beside her, Akio, barely 5, fiddled with the toy car he had been clutching since they left their old home. He didn't seem to notice the exchange, his attention entirely on the chipped plastic wheels. Bradley stepped out of the driver's seat, slamming the door harder than necessary, his silence as thick as the clouds overhead. Katrina sighed and followed, the cool October air biting at her skin. This was supposed to be a fresh start, moving to a smaller town, leaving behind the painful memories of Ethan's accident. But even now, standing in front of the house, Katrina couldn't shake the feeling that they had just run away instead of facing what had happened. The house was a relic from another era, the kind of place that had history carved into its very bones. As they began unloading the car, Katrina noticed the way the house loomed over them. It seemed taller somehow, its shadows stretching across the yard like fingers reaching out. Inside, the air was still, thick with dust and the scent of something old, forgotten. "We'll clean it up, make it ours," Bradley said, his voice strained but attempting optimism. He placed a hand on Katrina's shoulder, but it felt more like a gesture of obligation than comfort. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The truth was, she didn't want to be here. She didn't want to be anywhere. She just wanted things to go back to how they were before. But they couldn't. Not without Ethan. Mickey and Akio raced up the stairs, their laughter echoing through the empty halls. Katrina followed them slowly, each step creaking under her weight. When she reached the top of the stairs, she found them standing at the window Mickey had pointed to earlier. Akio had his nose pressed against the glass, his breath fogging up the pain. "I don't see him anymore," Mickey whispered, her voice barely audible. "See who, honey?" Katrina asked, kneeling beside her. "The boy," Mickey replied, looking at her mother with wide, serious eyes. "He was standing right here, watching us." Katrina's heart skipped a beat, but she forced a smile. "I'm sure it was just a reflection. There's no one else here but us." Mickey didn't argue, but as she walked away, Katrina couldn't help but feel uneasy. There was something about the way her daughter had said it, so certain, so calm, as if the boy had been as real as the walls around them. The first night in the house was restless. Katrina lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sound of the wind rattling the windows. Bradley was already asleep beside her, his breathing deep and even. She envied how easily he seemed to escape from the weight of everything. It felt like she hadn't slept properly in months. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ethan, saw the car, heard the sickening crunch of metal. At some point, she must have drifted off, because when she opened her eyes again, the room was bathed in the dim, silvery glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. She heard a soft, rhythmic tapping sound, faint but insistent. She sat up slowly, her pulse quickening. It was coming from upstairs. She glanced at Bradley, but he didn't stir. Slowly, she slipped out of bed and made her way down the hall. The tapping grew louder as she climbed the stairs, her bare feet silent against the cold wooden steps. It wasn't until she reached the second floor that she realized the sound was coming from the same window Mickey had pointed to earlier that day. As she approached, the tapping stopped. Katrina stood frozen in front of the window, staring out at the dark field below. Nothing moved, no sound, just the empty stretch of land and the faint outline of the distant woods beyond. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, her breath fogging the surface, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of the yard. A small, dark shape, unmoving, watching. But then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. She backed away from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. The next morning, the unease lingered. Katrina busied herself with unpacking, trying to distract her mind from the strange feeling that had settled over her. Mickey and Akio seemed unfazed, playing in the living room with their toys, their laughter echoing through the house. But as she moved through the upstairs hallway, something caught her eye, just a flash of color in the corner of the guest bedroom. She bent down, lifting the edge of the old rug that had been left by the previous owners, and froze. There, underneath, was a piece of paper, crumpled and torn, as if it had been hidden in a hurry. She unfolded it slowly, her fingers trembling. It was a drawing, a child's drawing, a stick-figure family, 2 adults, 2 children. But standing just a little apart from the rest was another figure, smaller but distinct. Its face, however, was missing. Just a blank, white space where its features should have been. Katrina's heart raced as she stared at the drawing, her mind racing through possibilities. Maybe one of the kids had drawn it. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But deep down, something about it didn't feel right. She found more drawings that afternoon, tucked under the bed, hidden in the closet. All of them the same. A faceless boy standing in the background, watching. That evening, as the sun began to set, Katrina was sitting on the porch when Mickey came out, her face unusually serious for a 7-year-old. "Mom?" she asked quietly. "What is it, Mickey?" "The boy. He says he's coming back tonight." The house had grown quieter in the weeks following Mickey's ominous warning. The boy she claimed to see, the faceless figure in the drawings, was becoming a topic neither Katrina nor Bradley wanted to discuss, but the silence was anything but peaceful. It was thick, like the air before a storm, and Katrina could feel the weight of something just out of sight, something she couldn't name, pressing down on her chest every time she walked through those darkened hallways. Mickey, though, had grown increasingly fascinated. She no longer feared the boy. In fact, she seemed almost expectant. She would stand at the window in the evening, her small body bathed in the fading light, her eyes scanning the horizon like she was waiting for something, or someone. "Do you think Mickey is all right?" Katrina had asked Bradley one night, her voice tentative, betraying her growing worry. Bradley shrugged, barely looking up from his laptop. "She's a kid. Kids have wild imaginations, Kat. She's probably just bored with the move. It's a big change." Katrina nodded, biting her lip, but it didn't feel like that. It felt heavier. Every time she looked at her daughter's face, every time she saw the way Mickey's eyes would drift towards the second-floor window, she felt a chill that she couldn't explain. And it wasn't just Mickey. Akio, usually cheerful and energetic, had become quieter. He didn't talk about the boy like his sister did, but sometimes Katrina would catch him staring blankly at the walls, his toy car lying forgotten in his lap. And then there were the drawings. She had found more, hidden in strange places, behind furniture, stuffed into the corners of closets. Always the same faceless figure, standing just a little apart from the rest of the family. It was too much to ignore. So one afternoon, while Bradley was at work and the kids were playing outside, Katrina drove into town to visit the local library. She had to know more about the house, about its history, about anything that could explain why her children were seeing things that shouldn't be there. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Klein, was friendly but curious about Katrina's sudden interest in the old farmhouse. "That place has been empty for years," Mrs. Klein said, pushing her glasses up her nose as she searched through the archives. "No one's lived there since the Millers moved out. Tragedy struck that family pretty hard." "Tragedy?" Katrina asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Mrs. Klein nodded gravely. "Dorothy Miller, she lived there in the 1930s. She lost her son before he was ever born. A miscarriage, they said. It broke her. She never recovered. Some say she thought her son was still with her, even after he was gone. She stayed in that house, talking about him as if he were still alive." Katrina felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She had expected something strange, maybe an odd story about the house's past, but not this. Not a tale that mirrored her own pain so closely. The loss of a child, the way it eats at you, changes you. She knew that feeling all too well. And then, Mrs. Klein continued, her voice lowering slightly as though she were telling a secret. "Dorothy just disappeared. One day she was there, the next she was gone. No one ever saw her again. Katrina's heart was racing now, but she forced herself to ask the next question. Do you think she was seeing something? Something that wasn't really there? The old librarian paused, her fingers resting on a yellowed newspaper article. She looked at Katrina for a long moment before replying, "Sometimes, when grief is too heavy to bear, it makes us see things that shouldn't exist. But whether those things are real, well, that's a question only you can answer." Katrina thanked her and took a few of the old articles Mrs. Klein had found for her, her mind reeling. On the drive back to the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening to her family, it was somehow tied to Dorothy Miller. The faceless boy, the strange behavior of her children. Was it possible that the boy Mickey saw was the child Dorothy had lost? Could grief really create something so tangible, so real, that it could reach across generations? That night, as she lay in bed beside Bradley, Katrina could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, more than ever. The wind outside howled against the windows, but there was something else, something she couldn't quite place. It was like the house itself was listening. Suddenly, a soft, rhythmic tapping echoed through the hallway, the same tapping she had heard on the first night, but this time, it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from Mickey's room. Katrina shot up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She shook Bradley awake, whispering frantically, "Do you hear that?" Bradley groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" "The tapping. It's coming from Mickey's room." Bradley frowned, sitting up and listening. The tapping was faint but steady, a sound that sent chills crawling up Katrina's spine. He sighed, throwing the covers off and getting out of bed. "I'll check on her. She's probably having one of those weird sleepwalking things again." Katrina followed him down the hallway, her pulse quickening with every step. The tapping grew louder as they approached Mickey's room, and when Bradley pushed the door open, they saw her. Mickey was standing in front of the window, her small hand pressed flat against the glass, her eyes wide and unblinking as she stared out into the darkness. "Mickey!" Bradley whispered, stepping into the room. She didn't respond. Her hand remained on the glass, her breathing slow and steady, as if she were in some kind of trance. Katrina moved closer, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. "Mickey, sweetie, what are you doing?" she asked softly. Finally, Mickey blinked and turned her head to look at them. "He's outside," she said, her voice calm. "He's waiting." Bradley exchanged a worried glance with Katrina. He crouched down next to Mickey, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Who's waiting, Mickey? Who do you see?" "The boy," she said simply, her voice eerily composed. "He wants to come in." Katrina's blood ran cold. Bradley stood up, his expression darkening. "All right, enough of this. It's a dream, Mickey. There's no one out there." But Mickey just shook her head slowly. "He doesn't want to hurt us, Daddy. He just wants to play." Bradley pulled the curtains shut, trying to stifle his frustration. Back to bed. No more of this nonsense. But as they tucked Mickey back into bed, Katrina couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air in the room felt thicker, heavier, as though something unseen was watching them. She barely slept that night, her mind racing with thoughts of Dorothy Miller and the faceless boy. The next morning, Katrina couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to know more. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the articles she'd brought back from the library, her coffee growing cold beside her. The stories of Dorothy's madness, her belief that her son's spirit was still alive in the house. It all sounded too familiar, too close to home. But it wasn't until Bradley mentioned the videos that everything started to unravel. "Katrina, I was looking through the videos I've taken since we moved in," Bradley said one evening, leaning against the doorway of the living room. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on something far away. "And I think you should see something." She followed him into the den, where he had his laptop set up. On the screen was a video of Mickey and Akio playing in the front yard, the late afternoon sunlight casting long shadows across the grass. It looked innocent enough, just two kids chasing each other, laughing. But then Bradley paused the video, his finger hovering over the screen. "Look," he said, pointing to the far edge of the frame. Katrina squinted, leaning closer. At first, she didn't see it, but then, there it was, just a shadow, a dark, almost imperceptible shape standing near the tree line, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. "It's probably just a trick of the light," Katrina said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Watch the next one," Bradley said, his voice tight. He played another video, this time of Akio drawing on the porch. Again, nothing seemed out of place until Bradley paused it at just the right moment. There, in the background, was the same shadowy figure, standing in the exact same spot near the tree line, unmoving. Katrina's stomach turned. "Bradley, what the hell is that?" "I don't know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "But it's in every single video I've taken. Always there, always watching." A sickening dread settled over Katrina, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to believe it, but there it was, undeniable. Something or someone was watching their children, and it wasn't just Mickey's imagination. Later that night, after they had put the kids to bed, Katrina and Bradley sat in the living room, the silence between them thick with unspoken fear. "We can't stay here," Katrina whispered, her voice shaking. Bradley nodded, but there was something in his eyes, something dark, something she hadn't seen before. "But what if it's not just the house? What if it's us?" The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The house was alive that night. It breathed with them, pulsed around them, and Katrina felt its grip tightening. Every shadow seemed to stretch, and every creak of the floorboards was louder than it should have been. The air itself buzzed with something invisible, something wrong. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the weight pressing on her chest wasn't just anxiety. It was something real. Mickey had been the first to act strange that evening, wandering away from dinner with a far-off look in her eyes. Katrina had found her in the upstairs hallway, standing in front of that same window, her fingers trailing lightly across the glass. When Katrina called out to her, Mickey didn't respond. She didn't even turn around. She just whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "He's waiting." The fear in Katrina's stomach had knotted so tightly she could barely speak, but she pulled Mickey away from the window, her fingers trembling against her daughter's small wrist. Mickey's skin was ice cold. "Mickey," Katrina whispered, crouching down to look into her daughter's eyes. "Who is he? Who's waiting?" Mickey's eyes flickered toward the window. "He says it's time. He says he's coming in tonight." Katrina swallowed hard, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Mickey, honey, there's no one outside. You're just tired." But Mickey only smiled, an eerie, detached smile, the kind that didn't belong on a child. "He's always been here, Mom. He's just waiting for us to see him." The words sent a jolt of dread down Katrina's spine. She scooped Mickey into her arms, more for her own comfort than anything, and carried her downstairs. Bradley was sitting on the couch, his laptop open on his lap, oblivious to the tension that had wrapped itself around the house like a noose. Katrina gently set Mickey down and tried to catch Bradley's eye, but he was focused on the screen. "Bradley," she said, her voice shaking. "We need to talk." Bradley looked up, his brow furrowing. "What is it now?" Katrina glanced at Mickey, who was sitting quietly, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. It's getting worse. She's saying things that don't make sense. We need to do something. We can't stay here." Bradley closed the laptop with a sigh, rubbing his temples. "Kat, we've been over this. It's just the stress of the move. Kids act out. You know that." "No," Katrina snapped, her voice sharp. "It's not just that. It's more than that. You've seen the videos, Bradley. You've seen the shadows. Something's not right here, and I don't care if it sounds crazy, but I'm not going to sit here and do nothing." Bradley looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in days. The exhaustion was etched deep into his features. And for a moment, Katrina saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. "You want to leave?" he asked, his voice low. "Where would we even go?" "I don't know." Katrina's frustration boiled over, and she could feel the tears burning behind her eyes. "I just know that staying here is making it worse. It's like the house it's feeding off of us." Bradley shook his head, standing up and pacing the room. "Kat, listen to yourself. You're not thinking clearly. You're letting your grief—" "It's not the grief." Katrina cut him off, her voice cracking. "It's the This place, this thing that Mickey keeps talking about, it's real. I know it sounds insane, but you need to believe me. Please." The silence between them stretched on, thick and oppressive. Katrina felt her chest tighten, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She could see it in Bradley's face, the battle between logic and fear, between wanting to protect his family and not wanting to admit that something unexplainable was happening. Before he could respond, a sudden thud echoed from upstairs, sharp and loud. Both of them froze. "What the hell was that?" Bradley whispered. Another thud, this time louder, and then the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. Katrina's heart was pounding in her throat. She and Bradley exchanged a terrified glance before bolting for the stairs. The sounds were coming from Mickey's room. They reached the top of the stairs and threw open the door to her room, but it was empty. The bed was neatly made, the curtain still swaying slightly from a breeze, but Mickey was gone. Katrina's heart dropped into her stomach. "Mickey!" she called out, her voice trembling. No response, but the dragging sound was still there, softer now, almost like it was coming from inside the walls. Bradley ran his hands through his hair, his breath quickening. "Jesus Christ, where is she?" Katrina turned frantically, searching the room, her mind racing, and then she saw it, the door to the attic. It was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness yawning beyond it. Without thinking, Katrina darted toward the door, yanking it open. The stairs leading up to the attic creaked under her weight as she ascended, Bradley close behind her. The air grew colder with each step, and the oppressive feeling that had haunted her since they moved in intensified. At the top of the stairs, they found her. Mickey was standing in the middle of the attic, her back to them, her small figure bathed in the pale light of the moon that filtered through a small window. She wasn't alone. The shadow was there. It stood just behind her, a dark figure, barely distinguishable from the shadows that clung to the corners of the room. Its form was indistinct, shifting, like smoke caught in the wind. But Katrina could feel it, its presence, its hunger. "Mickey!" Katrina screamed, rushing toward her daughter. But before she could reach her, Mickey turned around, her eyes wide and empty. "He's here," Mickey whispered. "He's always been here." And then, without warning, the figure moved. It shifted, its dark form expanding, stretching across the room like a wave of darkness. Bradley grabbed Katrina's arm, pulling her back as the shadow enveloped Mickey, swallowing her small figure whole. "Mickey!" Katrina's scream tore through the attic, but it was too late. The darkness consumed her. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Katrina stood frozen, her heart shattered, her mind reeling with disbelief. And then, slowly, the darkness began to recede. Mickey stood there, unharmed. But something was different. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, were now dull and lifeless. She looked at Katrina and Bradley, but it was like she was looking through them. "He's not gone," Mickey said quietly. "He'll never be gone." Katrina collapsed to the floor, her body racked with sobs. Bradley knelt beside her, his arms wrapped tightly around her, but there were no words of comfort he could offer. There was nothing they could do. The boy, the shadow, whatever it was, it had taken Mickey. They had lost her. The days that followed were a blur. Mickey was physically there, but she wasn't the same. She moved through the house like a ghost, silent and unresponsive. The boy no longer appeared at the window, but his presence was always there, lurking in the shadows. Katrina and Bradley tried to leave, but every time they packed their things, something would stop them. The car wouldn't start, the doors would jam, or Mickey would simply disappear again, only to be found standing in the attic, staring at the moonlit window. One night, as Katrina sat alone in the darkened living room, she heard Mickey's voice from the top of the stairs. "He's waiting, Mom," Mickey said softly. "He says you're next."